Non-physically based rendering. That's the point of this episode. I'm Liam from DigiWaza Multimedia. Thanks for joining me in this Blender 2.8 tutorial. Today we'll be discussing how to make our object in Blender not look photorealistic. In other words, we're not going to be using a physically based rendering material in an attempt to create photorealism. We're going to take the opposite route and go non-photorealistic. So we're going to do that by using the shader to RGB node, which is a new node in Blender, I think in the 2.8 series. And we're at 2.82 already. They're moving pretty fast, so kudos to the Blender team. Thanks for all you do. I really appreciate it. And this new node is pretty cool. All right, so let's get to work on that. I'm going to get rid of this cube. I'm going to hit X, delete. We're going to hit Shift-A. And for this first example, we're going to throw in the Suzanne monkey. I'm going to hit Control-2 to give it a subdivision surface level of 2. Right-click, and we're going to shade smooth. That'll give us our monkey there. All right, I'm going to back out, select my camera. I'm going to hit 7 on the numpad, and then I'm going to hit GX, and just bring it over here kind of off, not all the way on the center. And then let's hit 3 on the numpad, and then GZ to bring it down approximately to the Y-axis line here. I'm going to hit Alt-R to get rid of the camera's rotation, and then we're going to hit RX90 to bring it looking straight forward. If we hit 0 on our numpad, we'll be able to see Suzanne here. And all I'm going to do is hit RR, and I'm going to free rotate right over here so we can see her right kind of in the middle. Doesn't have to be perfect. This is just an example. And then after this Suzanne example where we build this shader, I'll show you 2 other examples on some work that I've done that can show you how cool of a thing you can get, or at least I think it's cool. All right, so I'm going to select Suzanne, and then let's just open a new window up here. Keep it simple. And then let's turn this into the shader editor. Let's hit N to get rid of that menu. And then let's give Suzanne a new material. As usual, it has the principled shader and a material output as by default. And so I'm just going to move this principled shader over and then move this material output over here so we can have some room. The cool thing about the shader to RGB node is it's going to be on the right side of the principled shader, which is, as you know, most stuff happens on the left side. So that's a little bit different. So let's go ahead and add it. Shift-A. It's going to be under Converter, and it's going to be right down here, shader to RGB. If we just drop it on the line, it'll connect for us. And then we're going to add a color ramp right here. So Shift-A. It's also under Converters, color ramp, and we're just going to drop that right on the line as well. Okay, so the way this works is if I come over to this window here and hit Z and go into rendered mode, we'll see what Suzanne looks like. And I'm going to have to go out of that mode for just a second to move the light forward here. So GY, and we'll bring that out in front of Suzanne so we can get some shadow. If I hit 0 on my numpad, we'll go back in. Okay, so now we see we have shadows because of the lighting. And what the shader to RGB node is it's going to allow us to assign colors to these shadow values. Up on the top here is a highlight. If I left click, we'll get our material back. Up here, it's the lightest color because the light's shining right on it. Under the brow here, and especially under the jawbones and on this backside, there's a lot more shadow data, so it's a lot darker there. So what we've done is we've taken the principled shader, plugged it into the shader to RGB node, and then now it's going to allow us to say which colors we want where. So it's kind of cool. All right, so the first thing that I'm going to do is let's talk about this color ramp. If you're new, color ramps are used for getting contrast between colors and textures, but it's also for assigning color as it is in this case, which if I grab this slider and move to the right, the more of this slider the black consumes, the darker the entire object becomes. So you can see if I go all the way over here, now we just have this black object because I'm more than half black. So if I go back this way and put it somewhere right in here where we get a good amount of dark shadow zone, that's looking pretty good. Now if we change this color, I'm going to change it. I have to bring this value up just a little bit. I'm going to change this into a blue color over here, like so. And let's just call it good right there. Okay, so now we see what we did. I've added in that dark zone that this slider is controlling, we've added in this blue color instead of black. And now our object is looking kind of cartoonish. A lot of times, though, in cartoons, there isn't shadows. But I like the look of the shadow here. So you could add in more of the white and make that come disappear out a little more if you want. And as you see, as you move it closer together, you get more contrast between the two colors. But you also start to wash it out with the color white. So I'm going to bring this back just a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to turn that color. Let's turn that to kind of an orange color, something like that. Now remember, we're making a cartoon here, a cartoon shader, so we don't have to worry about this looking like a real monkey. Obviously, it's kind of a cartoon head already, which is kind of cool. I think I'm glad they added this in here for people to be able to follow along with something like this. Okay, so now we can see that we have orange in these zones here, and then this purple color, this bluish color, and it's blue, but it's being mixed kind of with the orange in the mid-grade shadow zones, if that makes sense. So we still have it as our dark color here, and then we have the orange is taking up the highlight areas. So if we come back over here and hit this plus sign, we'll get another shader. Now it's going to come out in between these two colors. And so if I move this over closer to the other shader, or I'm sorry, the other slider, we can see we start to get kind of a much crisper, basically contrast in between the two colors. And then if we bring this in more, we can get more of that orange color, or we can slide it out. I'm going to slide it back over to here. We can also add another color in here if we want, and then change this color. I'm going to change this color maybe into a slight purplish kind of color, maybe somewhere in here. There we go, more in the red zone. And then we can start moving these together. And as we move these together, we start to get more contrast between the zones. So something like that might look pretty good. And we're getting like this purpley kind of orange color. Okay, so that's probably enough about the colors. You can mess with those all day, and we'll start to get you start to get this kind of airbrushed color. So let's start moving on the other side of this principled shader. So that's the basics of that. You can assign as many colors as you want. You can move them all together. I can move this over here kind of. I want that blue back, a little more of the blue. So I can move that over, and then we can start bringing these other colors together. If we want more of it, we can kind of move these around. Anyways, that's kind of the fun of it, is messing around with these colors. And trying to get contrast between them where you want it, and then not contrast where you don't. And we want to have at least two colors, but you can add as many as you want. Okay, so that's enough for that part. We'll get into the specifics of that a little more in my next example. But first, let's move on this side of the shader, on the left side of the principled shader. Two things in the documentation that it said are going to be canceled out when you're using the shader to RGB node. One of the things is Subsurface Scatter. So if we come over here to our Eevee render engine settings by hitting this camera, we'll see that we have these boxes. Screen space reflections will not work with this technique, and neither will Subsurface Scatter. So when we come onto our principled shader here, it's not really going to do anything if we use that. So I tried it and messed around. I thought it did something. I think it does something kind of. Which you might want to mess with it, but it's not going to give you subsurface like it is supposed to. It also said in the documentation that things upstream, meaning on this side of the shader to RGB node, may not act the way you think they're going to. So it can kind of mess things up. And so it basically kind of cancels out this physically based rendering shader here on a lot of fronts. Okay, so one of the things we can mess with, though, it doesn't really work the way it normally would, but it does do something cool, is the roughness. If we move the roughness back and forth, we can see we can bring back a little more of that darkness. Now, for me, this starts to look kind of cool, like an airbrush. We get this real smooth transition. We still have, because of our sliders are so close together here, we have good contrast between these two colors. However, this roughness shader, or I'm sorry, the roughness slider on the PBR principled shader seems to give it this cool, creamy texture that looks to me like an airbrush almost. So we're looking almost like an airbrushed monkey. So that's kind of neat. So always mess with the roughness to see what will happen. That's one control point we have. Another place, surprisingly, that we have some control is in our base color on this side, we can add in an ambient occlusion node. So if we hit Shift A, input ambient occlusion, and then I like to use a color ramp. So Shift A, converter, color ramp. We'll add that in there, click, and then once we do that, we of course have to come over here in our Eevee render engine settings and turn on ambient occlusion. And when we do, you can see immediately we get ambient occlusion. If I uncheck it, we don't have ambient occlusion. If I do check it, we do have ambient occlusion. So that's kind of neat. And we can bring up more ambient occlusion by using this slider if we want. So that's kind of neat. We can kind of get a cool effect that way. We can bring back some of this other data by moving this slider. And remember, when we move these two together, we get more contrast. I'm going to back this off just a little bit here, probably somewhere over here. Okay, and then you can also, as you well know, I'm sure, can click this open, and you can turn up the distance on this, and you'll get more ambient occlusion. Okay, so we start to get more lines and detail here that looks pretty neat. So that's the basics of the ambient occlusion. I think it adds a cool effect to it. It's probably not going to act exactly like it would in other material shaders, but it adds a cool effect here. Now, another thing that we can also do is we can hit and add textures in here, and the effect can be subtle depending on the colors you choose, but if we hit Shift A, texture, I'm just going to add in a noise texture just to show. Shift A, vector bump, and then color to height as per normal, and then into the normal slot. It'll take just a second for it to calculate out. When I have my screen capture software going, things take a little bit more time. So now we can kick this way up. And we have now this texture here. And then, of course, let's take this down. The strength's usually pretty high. If we take this down, we have a pretty cool texture going on. So you can use textures with this technique, and it'll add in some other data here. One thing that I've noticed when rendering animations with this technique is the higher polygon count your mesh is with this texture on there seems to really slow down your render times. So an optimized mesh would probably be best. And I'm really only talking about in my next example of the Yoda sculpt that I did. It has a couple 100,000 vertices in it, and when I add this texture to it, it takes a little bit of time to render as just a single image, but it also takes quite a bit of time, adds a lot of time to its render as an animation. So anyways, you can get kind of a cool look here by adding textures on this side. One last thing before we move on to the next section where I discuss a more detailed example is using Freestyle. So if we click over here onto our Eevee render engine settings and we go down to the bottom and we simply click this Freestyle button. Now if we open its parameters, the only controls you have right here are very limited, so it seems like Freestyle doesn't do much. I'm going to change this down to say, I don't know, 6 or so. 6, that'll make it a thinner line. And what Freestyle does, if you're not familiar with it, is it's going to attempt to put lines like an outline on our monkey or whatever we have in an attempt to make it look like more of an illustration, which again is what we're going for in this technique. So real quick, like before we talk about the other settings, if we come up here to render image, now we can see what it does. It renders out the texture and the kind of cartoon shader we have, and then it puts lines in here. All right, so I'm going to get rid of that real quick. Okay, the other place where you can hit the controls, so I always get that wrong. It's this one right here, right under the output settings. We see right here we have Freestyle, and now we have controls. We have a lot of controls that we can use here for this stuff. And so I've changed a couple of things around. I'm going to go down here. I did not change it yet. If I come down here where it says chaining right under it, I'm going to click it, and I'm going to put sketchy. And then I'm going to jump the rounds up to 5. And then it's very subtle, but if you render the image, then you end up, it looks a little more sketchy. There's a lot of controls here, so you can mess with it. Just remember, it's right here, this scene properties will give you a lot more controls of your freestyle. And that's its own course in itself, and that's about as far as I'm going to go with that. So that's with the freestyle there. Okay, and then one last place that we want to look at that we have control at is our light. So if I click out by hitting my middle mouse button, click on our light, and then I can click this light icon. We can change the color of the light. If I hit 0 on my numpad, we'll go back into our view. Changing the color of the light is definitely going to have an effect on your on everything we've done here. So you can change the color of the light by changing it to various different colors, and you'll see that it's actually changing our monkey around quite a bit. So just the color of the light is going to have quite a bit of control as to what our texture looks like. If we go down here where it says shadows, click it, and then we can turn on contact shadows. We'll see we get a lot more shadow data. And we can actually go down here where it says bias, and if we mess with this bias, we'll see that our shadow will be very sharp if our bias is very low. And then you can see the change as I move it around. So you get some subtle control here too. So this is just another control point to use. Also distance, you can get distance to do a little bit of difference here. So these are all just control points that you may want to use. Also the shadow itself, you can click its bias, it'll change as well. And then clip start will also have a little bit of an effect as well. So just remember, when you're in your light, the shadow zone, contact shadows can add more data, more shadows, more basically contrast in between areas, and that can get you a different look. It's just one more control point. Okay, and then the power of the light actually has a lot to do with how things look. We can turn this way down. It'll take a while for it to come down, but as I start getting it into the hundreds or so, we can get a different look by just turning the power of the light down. Okay, I'm going to turn that back up a bit just to get it back kind of where we were. Okay, and then one last place before we move on to the next example. If I click the Eevee render settings and we go down to the very bottom, color management. So if I kick that on, if we go to the one right here that says look, click on it, we can go to, I like high contrast. So let's see what that looks like. So now we get a high contrast, or you may want to have medium contrast. It just changes things around a little bit. And then of course, as usual, we also have our ability to affect our gamma. Sometimes our gamma can be a little high, and that washes things out a little bit. And then you can change your exposure if you like right here. And then we can also use curves. If we click that open, I'm going to just use the typical ploy on this, is grab a point here by left clicking, and then just move this up just a little bit, and then maybe grab one down over here, and then drag this down here just a little bit. And we can see we get a different look as well. So there's lots of control points on this technique. At first it's very subtle, and when you mess with it, you may get various results. But there's actually, by just having this relatively simplified node group here, we have a lot of control over what's going on here. I can turn down some of this ambient occlusion if we want. Of course, we can click over here and change it over here if we want, to where we have, a lot less. And then of course, when we render it out with our freestyle lines, then we can get kind of an illustrated look. Okay, so this has been just a very basic explanation of the shader to RGB node. I've seen some people with some very complex nodes using this, and they're getting quite excellent work out of it. For me, I've only really been using it as this simplified form. A couple of the times I've tried to use some of the more complex node groups. I didn't really get much more for my time. So I'm sure a lot of people are out there making it super complex, and they're getting really good results. But this should get you something pretty close. And remember, you can turn this texture off. You don't have to add it in there. I only put it in there just to show an extra part of this. All right, so next up is a real example of some of my work that I was doing for kind of a t-shirt look. And so let's get into that. Okay, here we are. This is the rendered animation of the example we just did. I'm going to go ahead and play it. And we can see it animates pretty quick. I think it was under a second a frame on my machine, which is probably a middle of the road machine. So that looks pretty good. Here's a more extreme color blend that I made. You can see that I just used different colors. We could still have the same effect. I added in a yellowish color, an orange color. Where those mixed with things, we got a little bit of a greenish color, the deep blues, and some purples. This is what you can do if you add a bunch of stuff. And of course, this is rendered with the Freestyle lines in, which I didn't do for the last example. So this is what this animation looks like. So it animates quite nicely, and if your model doesn't have too many polygons, it renders extremely fast. Okay, so let's get on to the next example. Okay, here we are in our first practical example. This is a Yoda speed sculpt that I did. You can check it out on my channel at Digiwaza Multimedia, or punch in Digiwaza Yoda speed sculpt and it should come up. This was sculpted in dynamic topology within Blender. And to answer somebody's question real quickly under that column, since this was in dynamic topology sculpting, it creates kind of a train wreck of a mesh. So painting it in Blender's texture painting settings or in, say, Substance Painter or even Photoshop is really not very practical. You'd have to retopologize the entire thing and then unwrap it in an organized way in order to get a good paint job. However, you can give it procedural materials like we're about to do, this one being more of an illustrated look, but you can try to give it more realistic looking materials procedurally, which is what I suggest. And by the way, like I said, this sculpture was created with the intent of being 3D printed, which is shown in the speed sculpt video as well. And so I didn't really find the need to retopologize it. In this example, though, I would like to have a t-shirt that, because I'm a fanboy of both Star Wars and Blender. So I created this Yoda head and I put on this Blender amulet, and then I put Blender You Will here. So I'm hoping to create a t-shirt for myself. Don't worry, Walt Disney or whoever else out there, I'm only going to produce one for me and maybe one for my wife. They're not for sale or anything like that, so hopefully I'm not infringing on anybody's territory there. Okay, so let's dive into this real quick, and I'm not going to change anything about this. I just want to show you through the node group real quick to see what we did. So if we open this up, we can see that, I like how Blender's doing that. I don't recall that happening before, but maybe it did. I might not have been paying attention. That's pretty frequent. Okay, so I have my principled shader here, just like always. We added our shader to RGB node. We added a color ramp node, and it's going into the material. If we look closely here, all I have 4 colors. I have a dark black, and then I have 3 shades of a green color. And then they're all bunched together here because remember, we want contrast between the color zones. If I spread these all out, it'll all kind of blur together, and it might not look right. Excuse me. All right, and so I just have these 4 colors. They're 4 shades of green, and that's all I have going on here. So let's look on this side over here. So if we look on the principled shader's left side, we'll see that I have a color ramp coming out of an ambient occlusion into a color ramp, and you can see I have the black cranked up quite a bit higher than was possible in our previous example. And the reason for that is this has a much more complex lighting system. Well, it's not really that complex, but it's more complex than our first example. So let's take a look at it real quick. Let's get this to move over here a little bit. I'm going to back out and hit Z, go into solid, and then we can see my lighting scheme. I basically have 3 area lamps right here. Actually 4. This is one over here too, but it's very small and it's not very powerful. And I probably could even get rid of it, but I left it just because I liked the look of the Yoda after messing around with it. And so I have an underlight that gives me lighting from below, an overlight that gives me lighting from the top, obviously, and then this backlight gives me the rim light effect. And then I also have a, if you click right here, it's actually just a point lamp, and I have it set to a purple color. These are all set, by the way, like this big one here is set to this bluish color. These are unusual colors. I get it. This is a dark one set pretty high. But this is how sometimes I work. I go for what I want it to look like at the end, so sometimes that's surprising what it has to be. Anyways, this isn't too complex of a lighting setup, but it does have everything to do with how our shader looks. So, and remember also, if I hit 0 and then we hit Z to go back into the rendered mode, another thing I didn't mention in the last example that's going to have a huge impact on your work is the color of the world. So you could use an HDRI, but any color you use here is going to change the look. And I have this black color, which also affects the work. So if that makes sense. So just remember, we have a lot of control points with this technique, and it's going to take a lot of messing around to get it to look pretty good. Okay, so let's go back to the shader. And in this example, I also kicked the roughness all the way up. And the reason for that is if I move in here close, you can see if I turn all the way down, he starts to look very slippery. and then we start going back into the realm of maybe more of a physically based rendered material or something in between. And I don't really care for the look in this application. So I just set the roughness all the way up, and I think he looks better that way. All right, some other things that we did. I for sure added the ambient occlusion in, and the black, as I think I said, excuse me. As I think I said, I'm able to take this black up here because of my lighting scheme and because of the world background. Again, in the first example, this really turned our whole monkey black all the way to where you couldn't see any details. And so that's not what we were looking for in that instance. So your lighting and your world settings are going to have a huge impact on what this looks like. And then as we move in close, you can see that I've got a lot of this kind of a skin texture here is solely from these two noise textures being mixed and going into a bump into the normals of the principled shader. So yeah, that's basically the material we got with that. So it's a combination of lighting in this instance and just the world environment, and then messing with the sliders between the ambient occlusion and all that as well. Also, we can go down into the color management settings, and we can see in the shadows. In this instance, what I did also that we didn't do in the first example was I set the shadows to high bit depth. By default, they're soft shadows, but high bit depth will get you a smoother shadow, which works good in this application. And then I also changed the cube size to 1024. Let's see what else we did. We went down to color management, and I went very high contrast, and you can see my S-curve in my curves. So that worked out pretty good. So overall, I really liked this look. He looks like an illustrated kind of comic book character, and I think it's going to make a cool t-shirt. So let's move on to the next example. Okay, so here we are in the third and final example. Let me pull this over so we can just take a look at it. In this scene, we have a black world background, and we have a very more simplified lighting system, and we're just making a black and white image here. You can see that we have a lot of interesting textures that kind of look like stippling and those kind of effects. I think it looks pretty neat. So let's look into it. Let's see what the shader looks like. So I'm going to pull this over here. Let's zoom this in just a little bit. All right, and so as per our other examples, we have our principled shader, and in between it and the world material output, just the material output, we have a shader to RGB node that it goes into, and then it goes out into a color ramp. And in this example, we really only have these couple colors. So not very many colors at all. It's just a black and white image. All right, so that's all the same as we've been doing in all the examples. If I look over here, we can see I have the ambient occlusion node just like before. We have the color ramp. Again, in this instance, the black value is way up, which in our first example, like just crushed it to black and gave no detail. Again, the reason why this is able to work this way is because of the world environment being black and then the combination of lighting that I have going on. So let's back out here. Let's hit Z to go into solid mode, and we can see what I have going for my setup here. Let's pull this over just a little bit, and we can see in this case all I have is a overhead area lamp pointing straight down. I didn't change its color. It's white. It's about 472.5 for its power. I didn't really mess with anything else in here. It's simply an area light set to around that power, and that's the power that worked. I'm going to hit the bottom one here, and we have the same thing. It's just white. Since this is a black and white image, I didn't want to color it by having any colors in the lamps. And it's about 156 on the bottom. I didn't change anything else here, so very simple lighting. You can see I have an empty here, and that's just for the animation. It's one of the ways I do an animation, by parenting the camera to the empty and then spinning the empty. You can also just spin the object too, but I find sometimes it's better to have this empty in there. All right, let's hit 0 to go back into front view and Z to go back into rendered mode. All right, so this is what the image looks like. I intended this to be I actually created this for for the end of the speed sculpt on this Skull and Bones, which you can watch on my channel. I use this at the end as kind of an animation. But I intend to use this possibly for a t-shirt or something else, which I think it'll look pretty good. Okay, let's get back to the materials then and see what else we had going on. So we talked about ambient occlusion, and the only thing else I did was added this noise texture and through a color ramp, which I didn't need to add. It's just kind of a habit. I didn't change the slider, so I don't even really need this. It goes into a vector bump node and into normals, just like it normally would. Okay, and so the material is very simple on this, and it really comes down to the background image and the lighting, which creating the look. Other things that I didn't put in there, or I did put in there, we have the ambient occlusion on in the Eevee render engine, which we need. In this example, I have screen space reflections on, but if I click it, you'll see nothing happens because screen space reflections don't work. And I made this prior to knowing that they don't work. Excuse me. And so I'm just going to turn it off right there. It was on from the last time I worked on this. Okay, and so I did go down into the freestyles. This image does have a freestyle. If I come up here and render the image, we'll see that it pops up, and it's very subtle. It's creating the freestyle strokes now. You can see them right here on the edges. There's a few in here like this. On the Yoda, I did not use freestyle because I thought it just didn't look right. But in this one, it actually adds some cool lines here and there that really help to set it off. So I have the freestyle lines active on this one. And then as we went down into color management, I had it on medium high contrast. I didn't use curves on this one. I didn't think it needed it, but you could use curves. So that's the basics of how we got this one to look. And I'll show a 360 spin of this animation at the end of this video. Anyways, that's it for now. I hope you liked this video. I hope you learned something, and I hope it helps your work. Consider giving me a like or subscribing if you can, and otherwise I'll see you in the next tutorial, and thanks for watching.